If you've ever felt like the world expected you to be strong to hold everyone else together, even when you were falling apart, then you might recognize a part of yourself in my story. My name is Lydia Sanders, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the one others turned to when life became heavy. In small-town Iowa, where everyone seems to know each other's business, the quiet burdens often go unnoticed. But behind every closed door, there's a story one that isn't always told. Growing up, I learned early that some families operate on unspoken rules. In mine, responsibility wasn't something you earned, it was handed to you the moment you could carry it. I was the dependable one, the girl with answers, the daughter who kept her tears tucked away for the sake of others' peace. At school, I got gold stars for showing up on time and never causing trouble. At home, I earned silent nods of approval for stepping in where things were broken. If you asked the people around me, they'd say I was strong, resourceful, steady as a rock. But what they didn't see was the cost of being the person everyone relies on, and what you lose when you give away your dreams, piece by piece. Sometimes I wonder when I first understood what it meant to be the caretaker. Maybe it was when my mother's illness grew worse and I learned to fill her shoes before I'd even finished outgrowing mine. Or maybe it was the look in my father's eyes when he came home from another exhausting shift, quietly asking for help without saying a word. For a long time, I believed that loving my family meant putting their needs before my own, no matter how small I felt in the process. I told myself it was noble. I told myself it would be enough. But the thing about carrying the weight of others is that you don't always realize how heavy it's become until you find yourself sinking. And so, this is not just a story about building a business or standing up for yourself. It's about all the invisible threads that bind us to those we love, and how sometimes the hardest work of all is learning to let go just enough to save yourself. Before I walk you through the moments that shaped my journey, the sacrifices, the betrayals, the breaking points, and the quiet acts of courage, I want you to know this isn't just my story. It's for anyone who has felt unseen while keeping everyone else afloat. It's for the quiet heroes, the eldest daughters and sons, the silent supporters who rarely get to tell their side. And maybe by the end, you'll see a part of your own journey reflected in mine. So let's begin at the beginning with a little girl in faded hand-me-down jeans, standing on a cracked porch in Iowa, watching the world wake up and wondering if one day she might get to dream for herself. Back then, I didn't have words for what I was experiencing. I just knew that in our house, love meant doing what needed to be done and hoping someone would notice. Looking back, it's clear that the seeds of my story were planted long before I ever opened my first lemonade stand or fixed my neighbor's old computer. They were sown in moments of quiet sacrifice and watered by a sense of duty I never questioned. Let me take you back to those early years, to the origins of a caretaker, and to the silent lessons that would shape the rest of my life. If you ask people to picture small-town Iowa, most will imagine peaceful mornings, open skies, and the sound of cornfields whispering in the wind. But my first memories are stitched together by something less poetic, the weight of responsibility resting quietly on my shoulders before I even understood what the word meant. Our house was a modest faded green box perched at the edge of Main Street. It was the kind of home that creaked in the wind where every corner showed signs of hard times. Some nights the wind would slip through the window frames, carrying with it a chill that made me pull my little brother Ben closer beneath the shared quilt. There was always something that needed fixing, a bill that needed paying, or worry that hovered above the dinner table. I was 7 years old when my mother Lorraine first became too tired to get out of bed most mornings. The doctors called it chronic fatigue syndrome, 3 words that sounded as heavy as they felt. My father Roy took on extra shifts at the grain mill, leaving before sunrise and returning long after dusk. In his absence, the rhythms of our house quietly shifted. The morning routine, making oatmeal, braiding my mother's hair, coaxing Ben to finish his homework, became mine. At school, I carried a backpack filled with textbooks and a heart full of worry about what might be waiting at home. In our town, neighbors sometimes whispered about the Sanders kids, always so polite, always so quiet, but never at the sleepovers, never asking for rides. The truth was, I didn't know how to ask for help. Somewhere along the way, I'd absorbed the lesson that our struggles were meant to be hidden, managed, and above all, never to become someone else's burden. It was an invisible script I followed without question, fueled by equal parts love and necessity. I remember my 8th birthday not for the presents, but for the way I spent the day. Mom had a bad spell that week, her energy flickering like a faulty bulb. Dad called from the mill to say he'd have to miss dinner overtime again. Ben was 4 and wanted nothing more than to blow out birthday candles with his big sister. So I baked a cake from scratch using the last of our flour, counting out eggs with careful hands, hoping the batter would stretch. That evening, as Ben's laughter echoed in the kitchen and Mom managed a tired smile, I felt a glimmer of pride. For a moment, it felt like everything was okay, because I'd made it okay. It wasn't until much later that I realized how unusual it was for a child to take on so much. At the time, all I wanted was for my family to be safe, for things to run smoothly, for Ben to have a birthday worth remembering. But small acts of caretaking slowly turned into habits, and habits became identity. I was the reliable one, the helper, the girl who could hold things together when everyone else was falling apart. It's a role that many eldest children know well, though few speak openly about how lonely it can be. Years later, during a support group for entrepreneurs, I heard the term parentification. It's when a child is pushed into adult responsibilities, too early, becoming in many ways a stand-in parent. At that moment, I saw my own story in a new light. I wasn't just being helpful. I was carrying a burden I was never meant to hold, and I was far from alone. Studies show that millions of American children are quietly parentified, each year stepping into roles that strip away parts of their own childhood. One afternoon in 5th grade, the school sent home a permission slip for the annual science fair. Ben wanted to build a volcano, the biggest one they'd ever seen, he insisted. But we didn't have money for supplies and Mom was having a rough week, so I found an old baking soda box in the pantry, scavenged scraps of cardboard from the recycling, and spent hours mixing vinegar with food coloring to make the eruption just right. I helped Ben paint the volcano, coached him on his speech, and sat in the front row at the fair clapping the loudest. When he won 3rd place, Ben ran to me, not our parents, to share the ribbon. In that moment, I realized my job wasn't just logistics, it was believing in him even when no one else could. Looking back, I see now how easy it is for love and duty to become tangled. My parents never asked me outright to become the family's safety net. But there's a way hardship writes its own rules, and mine were clear. Take care of others first, and maybe, just maybe someone will take care of you. If you've ever grown up in a house where every dollar is counted, where illness or circumstance means there's no room for error, then you understand how quickly a child's life can become more about survival than self-expression. The funny thing about responsibility is that it grows to fill whatever space you give it. By middle school, I was waking up early to pack lunches, checking Dad's weathered work boots for holes, making sure the laundry was done before Mom's next doctor appointment. Teachers praised my maturity. Neighbors complimented my manners. On the outside, it looked like I had everything under control. Inside, I sometimes wished I could be the one who needed help just once without feeling guilty for asking. As I got older, I started to notice the stories people told about kids like me. In movies, the strong ones are always noble, always selfless, always saving the day. But real life isn't like that. Strength can come from love, but it can also come from necessity, from not having any other choice. There were nights I cried quietly in the bathroom, so Ben wouldn't hear, wishing for a magic solution, a fairy godmother, or even just a friend who could carry the load for a while. One spring when I was 13, my mom's illness took a turn for the worse. She was in and out of the hospital, and I found myself cooking, cleaning, and even managing the household bills. Dad did his best, but the exhaustion wore him down. It was around this time that I discovered my knack for making a little go a long way. I clipped coupons from the Sunday paper, negotiated discounts at the local grocery store, and started babysitting for neighbors to earn extra money. That year, Ben needed new shoes for school. Instead of asking my father, whose pride was already bruised by our circumstances, I found a way to buy them myself. Realizing I could change things even in small ways sparked something inside me. I began to see obstacles as challenges, not just limitations. When I wasn't caring for Ben or helping around the house, I'd sit at the library for hours reading everything I could about business science and how the world worked outside our tiny corner of Iowa. I dreamed of a day when life wouldn't feel so precarious, when I could build something strong enough to shelter all of us. It wasn't all hardship. There were moments of joy too. Summer evenings chasing fireflies with Ben, or baking pies with Mom on her good days, or the rare Sunday when Dad brought home ice cream and we'd eat it straight from the carton, laughing as if nothing was wrong. Those flashes of happiness kept me going, reminding me that love isn't just sacrifice. It's also the ability to find light in the darkest places. Still, the lesson of my early years is one that shaped every decision, since when you're taught to put others first, it's easy to lose sight of where you end and they begin. The line between healthy responsibility and silent martyrdom is thin, and often invisible. It's a lesson I would revisit again and again as my journey unfolded. For anyone watching or listening who sees themselves in these words, I want you to know you're not alone. The invisible labor you do matters, but so does your happiness, your dreams, and your right to set boundaries. I wish someone had told me then what I know now. You don't have to choose between loving your family and loving yourself. It's not selfish to want a life of your own. As I stand here now looking back at that little girl on the porch, I see strength, yes, but also longing. Longing for a world where love didn't mean carrying so much alone, longing for permission to dream without guilt, and maybe longing for someone to finally say, you've done enough. Those early years set the stage for everything that followed. They were my training ground, my crucible, and in some ways my cage. But they also gave me the resilience I would need to face challenges much bigger than forgotten birthdays or empty pantries. Because when you grow up believing that nothing will happen unless you make it happen, you learn to move mountains, and sometimes you forget you're allowed to rest. I carried these lessons with me into adolescence, into high school, and eventually into a world where I would have to choose again and again between meeting the expectations of others and discovering what I truly wanted for myself. But before the world got bigger, before the choices grew more complicated, there was still more growing up to do at home. As I moved into my teenage years, the demands at home didn't ease. They only evolved. The question of who am I beyond what I do for others lingered at the edges of my mind, even as life swept me forward. In the next part, I'll share how talent sacrifice and the price of loyalty became the invisible script I followed, and how, without even realizing it, I began to trade my own dreams for a sense of belonging. Growing up in a home where every resource mattered, you learn early to notice opportunities, even the smallest ones. For me, discovering my own talent was less about chasing passion and more about survival. In middle school, I figured out how to fix old radios and computers using donated library books and scavenged parts from the recycling center. Soon I was the go-to problem solver for neighbors repairing leaky faucets or setting up email accounts for elderly couples. The payment was rarely more than a few dollars or a warm plate of cookies, but I felt something shift each time someone called me resourceful. It was as though being useful became a kind of currency, one I'd later come to rely on for better and for worse. By freshman year of high school, I'd started a small side hustle baking pies to sell at the Saturday farmers market. My mother's recipes, written in careful script on worn index cards, became my secret weapon. Each sale was a little victory, a reminder that even in the midst of struggle, I could make something beautiful, something that tasted like hope. Still, every dollar I earned seemed to vanish as quickly as it arrived, redirected toward groceries, electric bills, or Ben's school supplies. The idea of my own money never quite existed. It was just the family's lifeline repackaged with my name on the envelope. It's funny how pride and obligation can tangle together. I remember getting a scholarship letter in the mail, full tuition to a university 3 states away, for a program in business entrepreneurship. My guidance counselor was thrilled. My father tried to smile, but his worry creased deeper into his brow. It's a great opportunity, he said, but who will help with things here? I didn't even need to answer. The silence between us held all the unspoken truths that I was needed more at home than anywhere else, that dreams were luxuries reserved for people whose families could spare them. So I enrolled at the local community college, taking classes in accounting and marketing, while working 2 jobs shelving books at the library and waiting tables at the diner downtown. Sometimes I'd pass by the university billboard near the highway, smiling students, leafy campuses, all those possibilities, and wonder what my life might look like if I'd chosen differently. But whenever guilt crept in, I reminded myself of Mom's gentle gratitude when I came home with dinner, or Ben's proud smile when I helped with his homework. At 18, sacrifice still felt noble, not burdensome. Real-life examples of this silent loyalty are everywhere, though we rarely talk about them. A friend of mine, Maria, was a brilliant artist who turned down a prestigious art school to stay home and care for her siblings when her father passed away. Family first, she'd say with a brave face, but sometimes I'd catch a faraway look in her eyes, a longing for the life she'd put on hold. The truth is, in communities like ours, stories like Maria's and mine aren't exceptions. They're the rule. I realize now that these early choices made out of love come with invisible costs. Over time, loyalty can become a cage, one you build yourself bar by bar with every yes. You whisper when you mean maybe. As much as I cherished helping my family, there were moments I caught myself resenting the weight of it, like the night of my senior prom when I stayed home because Ben had the flu and Dad had an overnight shift. Or the summer I worked double shifts so we could keep the lights on watching classmates post pictures of road trips I'd never take. Sacrifice can feel empowering at first, especially when you're needed. It creates a sense of belonging even if it's built on struggle. But slowly, you begin to notice what gets left behind. Friendships you can't maintain, passions you set aside, ambitions that shrink to fit the size of your family's needs. Looking back, I see how easily I confused being loved with being indispensable. If I kept giving, I reasoned maybe one day I'd have earned enough good daughter points to finally follow my own path. There were bright moments too. Sophomore year, my business professor, Mr. Randall, noticed my knack for finding solutions. "You have a mind for strategy, Lydia," he told me, handing back a project with a rare A+. "Don't be afraid to think bigger." His encouragement felt like a window opening in a stuffy room. For a brief moment, I let myself imagine a future where my ideas could matter, outside my family's four walls. But at home, the narrative remained the same. "Lydia will figure it out," my parents would say, or "thank goodness for your help." I loved the pride in their voices, yet part of me wondered who I would be if I wasn't always the one fixing things. That's the paradox for many caretakers. The more you give, the harder it is to see yourself outside of the role you fill. If I could go back and give my younger self one piece of advice, it would be this: your loyalty is precious, but so is your potential. Loving your family doesn't mean shrinking your dreams to fit theirs. It's not selfish to pursue what lights you up inside, even if it means others have to learn to stand on their own. One autumn evening, I sat on the porch watching the last rays of sun fade across the fields. Ben came outside, taller now, his voice deepening with adolescence. He dropped beside me, silent for a long time. Then quietly he said, "Lydia, don't you ever get tired?" His words startled me, not because he'd noticed, but because he'd cared enough to ask. In that moment, I realized that showing my vulnerability didn't make me less valuable. It made me human. As high school ended, my world grew wider, but the family's needs only seemed to multiply. Medical bills, car trouble. Ben's tuition, all of it landed on my shoulders in ways big and small. Sometimes I wondered if I'd ever have the courage to choose myself. Would the people I loved still see me if I stopped being useful? That question lingered as I finished college and took my first real job at a small marketing firm, saving every penny for the just-in-case, moments that always seem to come. My boss once told me, "You're the glue here, Lydia. We'd fall apart without you." I smiled politely, secretly, aching for a different kind of praise, one not tied to how much I held together, but to what I could build on my own. The lesson of these years is simple but hard-won: giving doesn't mean you owe everything. Sacrifice is powerful, but not if it becomes your whole identity. You can love fiercely and still reserve some love for yourself. In the end, I carried all these lessons, the pride, the pain, the habit of saying yes, into the next chapter of my life, where I would be forced to decide, was I destined to play the role of the caretaker forever, or could I learn to be the hero of my own story? Life has a way of testing the lessons we think we've learned. Just when I believed I'd found balance, a new opportunity and a new challenge arrived, promising a different future, but only if I was brave enough to reach for it. In the next part, I'll share how building from nothing became both my greatest strength and my first major loss, and how every choice comes with a cost, no matter how much love is behind it. Sometimes the first step toward a dream is so quiet that you barely notice it happening. For me, that moment came late one night at the corner table of a campus cafe, surrounded by half-finished homework and empty mugs of coffee. My friend Mason Cooper, equal parts brilliant and awkward, was describing a problem he kept running into at his tech internship. There are so many companies drowning in data, and no one to help them make sense of it all. His words sparked something inside me, an idea I hadn't known was waiting. We talked until the cafe closed, sketching out the bare bones of a business on napkins, fueled by hope and the kind of optimism you only find in your early 20s. Launching our startup, which we called Bright Path Analytics, didn't happen overnight. It started small, like most things worth building. Mason brought the technical genius. I brought strategy and stubbornness. We scraped together our savings, set up in my apartment, and worked weekends and nights on a product we believed could help small businesses not just survive, but thrive. I remember our first office: a folding card table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a whiteboard scavenged from the college recycling bin. The window rattled in the winter wind, but it felt like the beginning of something big. The early days were a blur of long hours and longer lists. There were moments of excitement, like the day we landed our first client, a local bakery, that wanted to understand why their sales dipped in the spring. But there were also setbacks. Our first software demo crashed halfway through, and we had to drive across town in the snow to fix the owner's computer ourselves. We lost money, gained experience, and learned more about patience than any textbook could teach. Through it all, the demands of home never truly disappeared. Even as I typed code or pitched ideas to potential investors, my phone would buzz with reminders from real life. Ben needed money for textbooks. Mom's medication wasn't covered by insurance. The car broke down again. I'd slip away from business calls to pay bills online, then jump back into negotiations as if nothing was wrong. Mason never complained, but I could sense his worry. "You carry so much, Lydia," he once said quietly. "Are you sure you have room for one more thing?" I smiled, not sure how to explain that this was the only way I knew how to live. Looking back, I can see how the boundaries between my personal and professional life were never truly clear. My family's emergencies became my own. Every unexpected expense, every late-night call for help, quietly siphoned energy from the business we were trying to build. Still saying no felt impossible. The habit of prioritizing others, of fixing problems, was so deeply ingrained that I didn't even question it. Our big break came almost by accident. Mason's college roommate Emma mentioned that her uncle managed a chain of small retail stores and was frustrated by inconsistent inventory and lagging profits. We spent days preparing a proposal, worked all night refining our demo. And by some miracle, Emma's uncle decided to take a chance on two unknowns with more passion than experience. That first contract felt like a lifeline. We celebrated with takeout and laughter, believing for a moment that the hardest part was behind us. With new clients came new responsibilities. I juggled roles, marketer, accountant, customer support, while still fielding every call from home. As our revenue grew, so did my guilt. Each dollar we made seemed to come with a silent question: was I doing enough for my family? Should I invest more in the business or send extra home to cover the latest crisis? Sometimes I found myself transferring half my paycheck to cover a dental bill or unexpected car repairs, then lying awake at night, wondering how I'd make payroll. There are countless stories like mine, first-generation entrepreneurs, children of working-class families walking the tightrope between honoring where they come from and building something new. I once read about a young woman in Detroit who used her scholarship stipend to cover her mother's rent, even as her own startup teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. In these communities, loyalty is both a gift and a test. It shapes every decision, and sometimes it shapes who you become. The real test of loyalty, I discovered, isn't just about what you're willing to give, but what you're willing to risk losing. For me, that moment came when I was invited to present our company at a regional entrepreneurship competition, a chance to secure seed funding that could change everything. The night before, Ben called in a panic. He'd been in a minor car accident, scared and alone. My heart split in two. I wanted to be there for him, to prove that nothing mattered more than family. But I also knew that missing the competition could mean the end of Bright Path before it ever really began. I spent hours agonizing over what to do. In the end, Mason encouraged me to go, promising to check in on Ben and keep me updated. The next morning, my hands shook as I stood on stage pitching our dream to a panel of investors. I thought about all the years I'd spent choosing others over myself. For once, I let myself imagine a future where both could exist, where helping my family didn't mean erasing my own ambitions. We won third place. The funding allowed us to expand, hire our first employee, and move into a real office, no more rattling windows or makeshift desks. For a few months, I believed I'd finally learned to balance it all: loyalty and ambition, giving and growing. But life, as it often does, had its own lessons in store. Just as things were looking up, our largest client suddenly declared bankruptcy, leaving us with unpaid invoices and no cash flow. Overnight, we went from hopeful expansion to survival mode. I worked around the clock, calling vendors, negotiating payment plans, reassuring employees. At home, the needs multiplied. Mom's health declined again. Ben struggled at school, and my father's hours were cut at the mill. The weight of everything pressed down, threatening to crush the careful world I'd built. For the first time, I felt anger, a deep, unspoken frustration that I'd never dared voice. Why did it always feel like every step forward came with a new crisis? Why was it so hard to ask for help, to admit that I couldn't do it all? That loss of our biggest client, of financial security, of the illusion that I could be everything to everyone, became a turning point. It forced me to confront the reality that no amount of hard work or loyalty could shield me from disappointment. Sometimes things fall apart, not because you failed, but because life is unpredictable and no one can carry the world alone. If there's a lesson in those days, it's this: true strength isn't found in doing everything for everyone. It's found in knowing your limits and asking for help before you reach them. For every story of triumph, there are a dozen of hardship, of dreams deferred, of good intentions stretched thin. And yet there is beauty in starting over, in learning that failure isn't the end, but the beginning of something wiser and more real. As I rebuilt both my business and my understanding of what it meant to care for myself as much as I cared for others, I realized that the only way forward was to draw boundaries I'd never been taught to make. It would not be easy, and it would not happen overnight. But it was possible. The years that followed would test me in ways I never expected. With every step forward, the line between helping and enabling blurred, and I would need to learn slowly, painfully, how to honor both my family and myself. In the next part, I'll share how the weight of success brought its own challenges, and how I began to discover that the greatest gift I could offer wasn't just support, but the space to grow for all of us. Success, when it finally comes, rarely feels the way you expect. After years of struggle, BrightPath Analytics began to find its footing. We signed a steady stream of small business clients, word spread that our platform was easy to use and that we cared about people, not just profits. Our team grew, and for the first time, I could walk into an office that hummed with energy, a place built from scratch by Mason and me. The old worries didn't vanish, but they faded into the background as each new milestone arrived: our first positive quarterly report, the day we hired our 10th employee, the small article about us in the local business journal. For a while, it felt like proof that all the sacrifices had been worth it. At home, the news of my success traveled just as quickly. Suddenly, relatives who'd barely called before were sending messages of congratulations and requests for help. My parents, always proud, began to introduce me as our Lydia the entrepreneur. Neighbors dropped hints about their own children needing advice or a loan to cover emergencies. At first, every request tugged at the same soft spot I'd always had. How could I say no when I remembered what it felt like to struggle? Ben, who was starting college by then, called more frequently too. Sometimes it was to ask for guidance, sometimes for money, a new laptop, help with rent, books for class. I wanted to support him, especially after all the years we'd leaned on each other. But the asks grew bolder over time. When Ben changed his major 3 times in a single year and racked up fees for dropped courses, he called again. "You get it right," he'd say. "You know how hard it is to figure out your path," and I did, maybe too well. I began to notice how my willingness to help was subtly shifting the dynamic, not just with Ben, but with my parents too. When my father's car finally gave out, I wrote a check for a reliable used sedan, grateful to ease his worry, but uneasy when 2 months later, the insurance bill landed on my desk. "Just for this year," he promised, "until I get my next raise." My mother's medical needs grew as well. A new specialist wasn't covered by insurance, and I covered the bills with little hesitation. But gradually, what had once felt like loving support began to feel like an unspoken expectation. The line between helping and enabling is blurry, especially in families shaped by hardship. In my heart, I told myself I was making up for all the years we'd gone without. I wanted my family to feel secure, to know they could finally breathe. But there was an edge to some of the requests, a quiet assumption that Lydia will handle it. When I hesitated even briefly, I caught the subtle tone in Ben's voice or the quick glances between my parents. Disappointment, surprise, maybe even a hint of resentment. I'm not alone in this. Across the country, first-generation success stories often shoulder invisible burdens, feeling responsible, not just for themselves, but for everyone who helped them climb. I read about a young man in Houston who, after landing a well-paid tech job, found himself fielding daily calls from family for everything from utility bills to legal fees. At first, he felt proud to be their safety net, but as time passed, the pressure to say yes weighed heavier than the responsibilities of his career. The truth is, when help becomes expected rather than appreciated, it quietly turns into something else. I saw it in the way Ben delayed looking for work knowing I'd cover expenses. I saw it in my parents' reluctance to downsize their home, trusting that I'd step in if money got tight. The love was real, but so was the dependency. I wanted to believe I was lifting everyone up, but sometimes I wondered if I was holding them back from finding their own solutions. There's a particular pain in realizing your support may be enabling the very struggles you're hoping to solve. I remember a particularly difficult conversation with Ben after he failed a class for the 2nd time. "Maybe college just isn't for me," he said, voice full of frustration and defeat. I wanted to fix it to reassure him, but I also knew that stepping in yet again might rob him of the chance to learn from his own choices. That night, I lay awake questioning every decision I'd made, unsure if love meant stepping in or stepping back. One of my mentors, Ms. Ortiz, once shared a simple truth. The best gift you can give those you love is the belief that they can handle hard things. I realized I'd spent so long being the safety net that I'd forgotten to trust my family's resilience. If every challenge was quietly absorbed by my efforts, how would they ever discover their own strength? The lesson is a hard one. Support doesn't mean solving every problem. Sometimes love is believing someone can find their way, even if it means letting them stumble. I began to experiment with small boundaries, suggesting Ben take on a part-time job, asking my parents to contribute to their medical expenses. It wasn't easy. There were awkward conversations, some resentment, and a few angry silences. But gradually, I saw glimmers of change. Ben started tutoring classmates for extra money. My parents cut back on luxuries, finding pride in their own adjustments. At Bright Path, my personal journey mirrored my professional one. I had to learn to delegate, to trust others with responsibility, instead of micromanaging every task. The business flourished as our team grew more confident, taking ownership of their roles. I realized that letting go in both family and work was not a sign of abandonment, but an act of faith. Of course, not every experiment with boundaries was a success. Sometimes Ben slipped back into old habits, or my parents pushed the limits. There were setbacks and arguments, but also honest conversations that hadn't been possible before. With each step, I learned more about the difference between helping and enabling, between supporting and rescuing. The real measure of success I discovered wasn't in the size of my bank account or the number of people I could save. It was in watching my family stand a little taller, solve a problem on their own, and realize that strength doesn't always come from outside. It's built quietly and steadily from within. Even as I found new balance, life had a way of testing the limits of my love and loyalty. The next turning point would arrive not with a request for help, but with a betrayal. I never saw coming a family dinner that would challenge everything I thought I knew about what it means to give. In the next part, I'll share how one night changed the course of my story and what happens when the ones you love cross a line you never imagined could be broken. It's strange how the most ordinary evenings can hold the seeds of your biggest heartbreaks. That autumn, I invited my family to dinner, just the four of us, the way it used to be when Ben and I were kids. I'd spent all afternoon preparing a meal with their favorites: roast chicken with lemon potatoes, crisped in the oven, a chocolate pie from my mother's old recipe. The table was set with candles flickering against the window, and for a moment I allowed myself to imagine that this would be a night of celebration, of family, of everything I'd worked so hard to keep together. The first hour was filled with small talk. Dad joked about the neighbor's new dog. Ben shared stories from his tutoring job. My mother complimented the pie, and for a while, laughter drifted easily between us. Yet underneath the warmth, I felt a tension, like the air before a storm, charged and restless. It was subtle at first, a sideways glance here, a hesitant pause there. Looking back, I wonder if I knew deep down that something was coming. But some lessons only arrive in their own time. After dessert, my father cleared his throat and reached for an envelope tucked beneath his chair. My mother's eyes flicked to mine, anxious and hopeful all at once. "We've been thinking," Dad began, sliding the envelope across the table, "about the future of the family and your role in it." His voice was careful, rehearsed. I reached for the envelope, heart pounding, and unfolded the documents inside. As I scanned the pages, the words blurred together at first. My parents had met with a lawyer, one I'd never heard of, and drafted an agreement to transfer a significant portion of the shares I'd set aside for family security to Ben. "He's younger," my mother explained, twisting her napkin. "He's still finding his way. You're established now, Lydia. We know you can rebuild if you have to." I stared at her, the meaning sinking in slowly. They had made a decision about my future, my sacrifices, my company, without even asking me. Betrayal is a word we reserve for enemies, but the deepest wounds come from those closest to our hearts. I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. My whole life, I'd worked to ensure my family's comfort, taken on burdens, so they wouldn't have to. And now, the things I'd built intended as safety nets were being redistributed in the name of fairness. "You're strong," Dad insisted, misunderstanding the pain in my silence. "You always land on your feet." Real-life stories like mine are not uncommon, though they're rarely told aloud. I remember reading about a woman in Boston who, after years of supporting her siblings and parents, discovered that her family had sold her childhood home, her only inheritance, without consulting her. The logic was always the same: you have more, so you should give more. the math of love reduced to a ledger where the responsible one is punished for their reliability. In that moment, I felt two things at once: heartbreak and clarity. I realized that my place in the family had become transactional. Every act of generosity, every sacrifice, had built an expectation that I would always be able to give more. It wasn't about love anymore, it was about what I could provide. And in their eyes, that meant my own security was negotiable, expendable. The conversation that followed was tense, each of us circling our own hurts. My mother insisted they only wanted what was best for both their children. Ben, for his part, looked away, cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and entitlement. "It's not personal," Dad said, as if that could soften the blow. But there are few things more personal than realizing you're valued for your usefulness, not your presence. That night after my family left, I sat alone in the kitchen, the flickering candles now little more than puddles of wax. I thought about all the years I'd spent solving problems, holding things together, believing that love and loyalty would always be enough. For the first time, I questioned whether my sacrifices had been seen at all or simply expected. The lesson in that moment was bitter but necessary. If you never set boundaries, people will build their comfort on your exhaustion. The roles we play, especially in families shaped by struggle, can become prisons if we're not careful. We can give until there's nothing left and still be asked for more. It's not selfish to draw a line, it's necessary for survival. In the days that followed, my family's decision reverberated through every part of my life. I spoke with Mason, who listened quietly, anger flickering in his eyes on my behalf. I called the lawyer whose name was on the documents and discovered to my relief that nothing was final, no signatures, no irrevocable transfer. Still, the trust between us had shifted. I realized that protecting my work, my well-being, and my sense of self would require more than hope or good intentions. It would require action. I wrote a letter to my parents not out of anger, but from a place of exhausted clarity. I explained that I loved them deeply, but I could no longer play the role of the family's endless provider. I would not sign away my company shares, and I would need time to decide what support, if any, I could offer in the future. The response was as mixed as you'd expect. Disappointment tears, accusations of selfishness. Ben called once asking if we could talk, but I needed space. For the first time, I chose myself. If you're listening and have found yourself in a similar place, know this. It is not betrayal to protect what you've built. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand your ground when those you love most don't understand your boundaries. Our value is not measured in what we can give away, but in how we honor our own needs. After the dust settled, I spent long evenings walking the quiet streets of my neighborhood thinking about the future. I wondered if I could ever rebuild trust with my family, or if this was the start of a new chapter 1 where I learned to love from a safe distance. The answers didn't come quickly, but I knew one thing for certain: the person I was becoming deserved a seat at the table, not just a place on the menu. When you draw your first real boundary, the world doesn't always respond with applause. Sometimes it answers with silence or anger or grief. But in that space, painful as it is, something else begins to grow: the possibility of a life that finally includes you. In the next part, I'll share how guilt loss and the long road to boundaries shaped my journey, and how I learned that real love doesn't demand self-erasure. It invites you to show up fully and honestly as yourself. If you've ever tried to change the script your family has written for you, you know that the silence after you say no can be louder than any argument. In the days and weeks after I drew my boundary, that silence pressed on me from all sides. I kept replaying the dinner in my mind, each word and glance growing sharper in memory. My phone buzzed with messages, some pleading, some angry, all colored by a sense of disbelief. For years, I'd been the reliable one, the fixer, the person who always showed up. Now suddenly, I was the problem. It hurt in ways I wasn't prepared for. The guilt was relentless. I found myself walking around my apartment at midnight, staring out the window, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Had I overreacted? Was it selfish to protect what I'd built? My parents' voices echoed in my head: after all we've done for you. Even Ben, usually the more easygoing one, sent a long text saying he hoped I'd come to my senses before the family fell apart. For the first time, I truly questioned who I was if I wasn't the person holding everything together. In moments like these, it's easy to romanticize the past, to remember only the laughter, the shared meals, the sense of belonging. But healing, I learned, requires honesty. I started therapy hoping for answers, and found instead a gentle unraveling. My therapist explained the idea of parentification, how children who are forced into caretaking roles too early can struggle to distinguish love from obligation. You were taught to be needed, she said, but not always to be seen. That sentence hit me harder than any confrontation ever had. I began to notice just how much of my life was structured around other people's needs. I'd built a business but rarely celebrated my own wins. I nurtured friendships but hesitated to ask for help when I was struggling. Even my quietest joys, reading, walking, journaling, felt like luxuries stolen from time that could be useful. The more I reflected, the clearer it became. Boundaries weren't just about saying no to my family, but about saying yes to myself. Real-life examples helped me see that I wasn't alone. I joined a small online support group for adult children of responsibility. Each week, members shared their stories: the teacher whose mother demanded she send half her paycheck home, the nurse who'd never taken a vacation because her siblings relied on her to solve every problem, the engineer who'd paid for her brother's third failed business. There was a common thread: love twisted by guilt, until it became something heavy and hard to carry. It helped to hear others speak aloud the fears I'd kept hidden, that setting boundaries meant abandonment, that you could lose your family just by asking for space. Still, the pain lingered. Holidays came and went without invitations. My mother posted cryptic updates on social media about family rifts and children who forget where they come from. Ben's girlfriend reached out once, asking if I'd reconsider for the sake of peace. I wondered often if my solitude was worth the cost. There were nights when the loneliness felt unbearable, when I nearly dialed their numbers just to apologize and promise anything to make things feel normal again. But then, something shifted. As the weeks passed, I noticed a quiet strength returning. Small things: waking up without dread, enjoying coffee in the morning sun, laughing with Mason over a work mishap, reminded me that life could be full, even in the absence of approval. I found myself reconnecting with old friends, seeking out new hobbies, letting myself dream a little further than before. I realized that the parts of me that had always been there, the resourceful, creative, loving parts, didn't disappear just because my family wasn't close. In fact, they began to bloom in ways I hadn't expected. One evening during a therapy session, I shared my fear of being alone. My therapist smiled gently and said, "Lydia, boundaries aren't walls. They're doors that you get to open or close depending on what's healthy for you." The metaphor stayed with me. I started to see my boundaries not as a rejection of my family, but as an invitation to choose my own life, to invite people in on my own terms when I felt ready. The lesson of those months is this: guilt is not proof of wrongdoing. It is simply a signal that you are rewriting patterns that have kept you stuck. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit with the discomfort of disappointing others, trusting that your well-being matters too. Over time, the sharp edges of guilt softened, replaced by something steadier: self-respect and a growing sense of peace. Gradually, small signs of change appeared. Ben sent a short email, just a line or two, saying he was looking for work and hoped I was okay. My mother's messages shifted from anger to quieter updates about her garden, her health. My father, never one for words, mailed a birthday card with a simple note: "Proud of you always." They were small gestures, but they felt like the first green shoots after a long winter. Real boundaries, I learned, don't always restore relationships to what they were. Sometimes they create something new: a respect for distance, a shared understanding that love can exist even when contact is limited. My family and I weren't as close as before, but there was less resentment and less fear that everything depended on me. We were finding our way step by slow step. At work, too, I noticed a difference. I delegated more, trusted. My team allowed myself to step back without guilt. The business grew, but so did my own capacity for joy. Mason became not just a business partner, but a true friend, one who saw me not just for what I could give, but for who I was. If there's a small lesson here, it's this: healing is not linear. There will be setbacks, days of doubt, even longing for what you left behind. But the more you practice honoring your own needs, the stronger you become, not in spite of your boundaries, but because of them. As I continued down this road, I began to understand that rebuilding isn't about returning to what was lost, but about creating something new from the inside out. In the next part, I'll share how starting over, both in business and in life, became a source of power rather than pain, and how the courage to let go opened the door to a future I'd never dared imagine. Starting over is something people talk about as if it's a fresh, clean slate, a sudden liberating leap into the future. The truth is much messier. For me, rebuilding was a slow return to myself, a process that began not with grand plans, but with small acts of bravery, waking up on hard mornings, showing up for my team when it would have been easier to hide, and trusting that I was more than the roles I'd lost. The first step was practical. After drawing boundaries with my family, I realized my attention and energy had returned little by little to the company Mason and I had built. BrightPath Analytics had survived the storm, but barely. Finances were tight after our biggest client's collapse and the distraction of personal turmoil. Employees were anxious, morale was shaky, and the future felt uncertain. It was tempting to retreat to do only the minimum required, but something inside me knew this was a chance to rebuild, not just the business, but the foundation of my own life. I started by being honest with myself and with my team. At our Monday meeting, I stood before everyone and admitted we'd hit tough times. I didn't pretend to have all the answers. Instead, I invited their ideas, their worries, and their hopes. Mason and I spent late nights in the office, not just strategizing about clients, but checking in on each other, talking openly about stress and dreams. I realized that leadership was less about control and more about creating a space where everyone, myself included, felt safe enough to try, fail, and try again. One of the most profound lessons came when I stopped micromanaging. My need to be involved in every detail, born from years of caretaking, had quietly stifled creativity on the team. As I let go, people stepped up. Our junior developer, Priya, pitched a new analytics feature that eventually attracted a wave of small businesses to our platform. Our operations manager, Louise, found a way to streamline support tickets, reducing customer complaints by half. Each time someone succeeded, I felt a mix of pride and humility. They didn't need me to rescue them. They needed space to shine. Outside of work, starting over meant rediscovering myself as a person, not just a provider. For years, my calendar had been filled with obligations, family emergencies, work deadlines, last-minute requests. Now, I gave myself permission to schedule things that brought joy even if no one else benefited. I signed up for a ceramics class at the local arts center, something I'd always been curious about but never had time to try. My first attempts were lopsided and full of cracks, but I loved the feeling of clay between my hands, the gentle focus it required. Sometimes the world reflected back the lessons I was learning. One night after class, I got coffee with another student, Jamie, who shared that she'd recently left a corporate job after a health scare. I thought starting over would be a disaster, she confessed, but it's been freeing. I finally get to build a life that's mine. Her words resonated deeply. I realized that while loss was painful, it had cleared the ground for something new to take root. Rebuilding also meant learning to ask for help, a skill that didn't come naturally. When a technical problem threatened to derail a major client project, I called in an outside consultant. Instead of seeing it as a failure, I saw it as a collaboration. Together, we solved the problem, and in the process, I built new relationships that led to unexpected business opportunities. I learned that seeking support isn't a sign of weakness. It's a declaration of hope that others will rise to meet you. Not every day was easy. There were setbacks, projects that fell through moments of loneliness, and days when memories of family hurt still stung. But as the months passed, I noticed I was less defined by what I'd lost and more energized by what I was creating. The business stabilized, then began to grow. New partnerships blossomed, bringing in steady revenue and allowing us to expand our reach. Perhaps the most unexpected change was how my relationship with myself softened. The old voice in my head, the one that said I was only as valuable as what I gave, began to quiet. I started to believe I was worthy of good things, not because I'd earned them through sacrifice, but simply because I existed. That shift was subtle, but life-changing. I found myself laughing more, sleeping better, even dreaming of future adventures, travel, writing friendships that felt like family. One weekend, Mason and I took the team on a retreat to the lakeshore. As we gathered around a bonfire, sharing stories and toasting marshmallows, I realized how far we'd come. The company was more resilient, not in spite of hard times, but because of them. We'd learned to adapt, to support each other, to innovate. I saw in the eyes of my colleagues a trust that went beyond paychecks or titles, a trust rooted in honesty and care. The lesson of rebuilding is simple. Though never easy, every ending is also a beginning. The power to start again lies in our willingness to let go, to forgive ourselves, and to believe in a future that doesn't look like the past. There will be costs. Old relationships may fade, comfort may be lost, certainty may vanish. But what grows in their place can be richer and truer than anything you imagined. As spring returned to Iowa, I felt hope blooming again, both at work and in my heart. I began to reach out to my family not to erase the past, but to see if new, healthier patterns could form. We exchanged cautious messages, small but sincere. I didn't rush. I didn't bend my boundaries to win approval. Instead, I trusted that if healing was possible, it would happen on honest, mutual terms. Moving forward, I realized that rebuilding wasn't just about business or even family. It was about redefining success and choosing relationships that honored the whole of who I was. In the next part, I'll share how standing tall, redefining family and success helped me find peace and joy that came not from what I could give, but from who I had become. Redefining success was something I never imagined would become the center of my life. For years, I'd equated it with external measures, the numbers in the bank account, the milestones reached, the smiling approval of those around me. But when the old patterns finally fell away and I stood at the edge of what I thought I'd lost, I realized that true success had little to do with what could be measured or praised. It lived instead in quieter, deeper places, the ability to feel peaceful in my own skin, the freedom to choose how I spent my days, the power to define family on my own terms. After months of healing and rebuilding, Bright Path Analytics was thriving again. Our small team had become a true community filled with laughter and mutual support. I found myself mentoring young women, many from backgrounds as challenging as mine, teaching them about business but also about boundaries, resilience, and self-worth. It was fulfilling in a way that awards and client wins never quite managed. Seeing someone else stand a little taller because of something I'd shared was a quiet, enduring kind of joy. I also began to reimagine what family could mean. I kept in touch with my parents and Ben, but the expectations had changed. No longer was I the endless provider. Instead, we communicated with more honesty, and if old patterns threatened to return, I spoke up gently but firmly. It was awkward sometimes, even tense, but each conversation built a new foundation, one made not of duty, but of choice. We were learning, all of us, to value each other's presence, rather than just our usefulness. At the same time, a new kind of family was forming in my life. My closest friends, Mason, a few former college classmates, and some neighbors who'd supported me through rough times, became a circle of belonging as real as any blood ties. We celebrated birthdays, and work wins, brought soup when one of us was sick, and gathered for movie nights that stretched late into the evening. There was a lightness to these relationships, a mutuality that asked nothing more than authenticity and care. One real-life moment stands out. After a particularly stressful quarter, Mason insisted I take a long weekend. Reluctantly, I agreed. That Saturday, he and our friends planned a picnic by the lake. There was no agenda, just music, shared food, the sun on our faces, and the simple, radical pleasure of rest. For the first time in years, I felt myself relax truly and fully. Lying back on the grass, listening to laughter drift over the water, I realized that this was the kind of success I'd always longed for: time presence. And the freedom to enjoy the company of people who cared for me, not because of what I could do for them, but simply because I was me. That shift in perspective opened up even more possibilities. I started volunteering with a local entrepreneurship nonprofit supporting women who, like me, were often pulled in too many directions. Their stories echoed my own, torn between loyalty to family and loyalty to their dreams. Together, we built a support group where we could share setbacks and victories, fears and hopes without shame. I watched as each woman discovered her own version of standing tall, her own unique blend of ambition and compassion. Redefining family also meant forgiving the old wounds, not because the hurt was forgotten, but because I wanted peace more than I wanted proof. I learned to see my parents not as villains or victims, but as people shaped by their own struggles and limits. Sometimes love is simply accepting what another can and cannot give. Our conversations were more tentative now, but also more real. When Ben landed his first steady job, he called not for money, but just to share his excitement. My mother mailed me a recipe clipped from a magazine with a note. "Thought you'd like this, miss, our kitchen talks." These gestures, small but sincere, felt like signs that something new was growing in the place where pain had once lived. Of course, there were moments of doubt. Sometimes the old guilt tried to creep back in, especially during holidays or when I saw families on social media who seemed effortlessly close. But then, I'd remember what I'd built: a network of genuine support, a workplace where everyone's voice mattered, and a life filled with meaning and choice. That was a kind of abundance that ran deeper than any old measure of success. The lesson I learned in these months was profound. Real success isn't about how much you can hold, but about how deeply you can root yourself in what matters. It's the courage to say no when needed and the grace to say yes to what brings joy. It's about building relationships that lift everyone up, not just those who can give the most. And it's about defining family as the people who help you become more yourself, whether they share your blood or just your heart. As Brightpath grew, I was often asked to speak at events, share my success story, and give advice to the next generation of entrepreneurs. I'd always begin by reminding people that behind every strong woman or thriving business, there are invisible struggles, failures, and decisions that shape the outcome. Stand tall, I'd tell them, not just for others, but for yourself. Your dreams matter, and so does your happiness. I realized too that standing tall sometimes means letting go of old identities of relationships that can't change, of the need to please everyone. It's bittersweet, but it leaves room for real connection, honest growth, and the kind of love that endures. I found that when I let go of the role of the martyr, I became a better friend, leader, and daughter. My life was no longer measured by what I sacrificed, but by what I created and nurtured within myself and in the world around me. As the seasons changed, so did the nature of my connections with family and friends. The time was coming for a different kind of reunion, one where new boundaries and old hopes would be put to the test. In the next part, I'll share how facing the people who once hurt you this time on your own terms can lead to reconciliation, healing, or even a new beginning neither side expects. Time, I've learned, has a quiet way of softening sharp edges. As months slipped into a new year, the ache of distance from my family became less of a wound and more of a scar, a reminder of what had been lost, but also of the healing that was finally taking root. I began to sense that I was ready, or at least willing, to try reconnecting, not from a place of guilt or obligation, but from a genuine hope that things could be different this time. Reunions, after all, are not always about restoring what was. Sometimes they are about forging something entirely new. The first invitation came as a surprise, an email from my mother's subject line, dinner. The message was short, hesitant, as if she was afraid I might say no. Would love to see you and catch up. No expectations. Just us. I spent a long time staring at the screen before replying. My heart was thumping with a mix of anxiety and hope. I replied simply, I'd like that. Let's try. We met at a quiet Italian restaurant halfway between our homes. The first few minutes were awkward talk of the weather, of work, of how quickly Ben's kids were growing. But as the meal went on, I noticed that the usual script was missing. There were no hints about money, no sidelong glances, no lists of problems waiting for solutions. Instead, my mother shared stories about her new garden, how she'd started painting again, and how she was volunteering at the community center. When the check came, she reached for her wallet and we split it down the middle, something that had never happened before. That night, I walked home feeling lighter. The conversation hadn't fixed everything, but it had opened a door, a chance to rebuild with new terms, new boundaries. I realized that love, when given space to breathe, could change shape. It didn't have to look like endless sacrifice. It could look like respect, like choice, like two adults meeting as equals. A few weeks later, Ben called. He wanted to meet for coffee. When we sat down, he didn't ask for help, but instead shared that he'd been struggling since losing his job and had finally reached out to a career counselor. I know I leaned on you too much, before he admitted, looking a little sheepish. I'm trying to figure things out on my own now. It's hard, but I think I need it. I felt a wave of pride for him, a feeling I hadn't expected. We talked for hours, and as we left, he hugged me tight. Thanks for believing in me, even when I made it tough, he said. It was the most honest moment we'd shared in years. Real-life reunions aren't always this gentle. Sometimes old wounds resurface. I've spoken to others who, when they tried to reconnect after setting boundaries, faced defensiveness, anger, or even denial. One woman, I know her name is Angela, tried to reestablish contact with her sister after years of estrangement. The first few meetings were fraught with tension, but over time, as they both stuck to their new rules, a fragile peace emerged. They learned to talk about the present, not rehash the past, and to let their relationship grow at its own pace. The lesson I carried into every interaction was this: forgiveness and boundaries are not opposites. They are partners in healing. True reconciliation is not about pretending nothing happened, but about agreeing on what comes next. My therapist once said, "You can't change the past, but you can negotiate the future." I tried to remember that each time I felt tempted to fall back into old habits of rescuing, fixing, or shrinking myself to fit someone else's comfort. Of course, not everything was smooth. There were slip-ups. My father at a family barbecue started to complain about a car repair bill. I felt the old urge to offer money to rush in and fix things. Instead, I listened, nodded sympathetically, and let the silence hang. To my surprise, he didn't push. Later, he called to say he'd figured it out himself and sounded proud. Each small victory like this reminded me that letting go wasn't abandoning my family, it was making room for all of us to grow up and grow closer. One of the most powerful changes came with how I approached family gatherings. Before I'd arrive early, stay late, and make sure everything was perfect. Now I allowed myself to show up as a guest, not a caretaker. I brought a dessert to share, but I didn't organize or manage. I enjoyed the laughter and chaos, then left when I needed to, without guilt. This was a subtle but radical act, the act of loving without losing myself. I also started to notice who respected my boundaries and who still struggled with them. Some extended relatives used to seeing me as the fixer withdrew a bit. Others surprisingly reached out to say how much they admired my journey and were inspired to set limits of their own. It became clear that the changes I'd made rippled outward, giving others permission to rethink their own relationships and expectations. There's a practical side to all this too. I learned to be clear and direct. I can help, but only in this way. Or I can't be there, but I hope it goes well. I wrote down my non-negotiables before each family event and checked in with myself afterward. Was I acting from love or from fear? Was I present because I wanted to be or because I felt I had to be? These questions became my compass, guiding me toward healthier connections. If there's a lesson here, it's that real love grows when everyone is allowed to be whole, messy, changing, and independent. Boundaries are not punishments. They are invitations to meet each other with honesty and respect. The new rules of love in my life were simple. Say what you mean what you say, and trust that the people who are meant to stay will find their way to meet you in the middle. As the year drew to a close, I reflected on how far we'd come, not just as a family, but as individuals learning to relate in new ways. Our reunions were quieter, less dramatic, but more real. I cherished the moments of laughter, the honest conversations, and the deepening sense of trust. There was grief for what was lost, yes, but also gratitude for what was being built slowly, patiently, one boundary at a time. In the final chapter of my journey, I began to see that healing forward meant embracing not just new relationships, but a new self, a self defined by compassion, courage, and the freedom to choose my own path. In the next part, I'll share how these lessons carried me into a life of unexpected fulfillment, and how even after the hardest losses, the future can be brighter than you ever imagined. Healing, I've come to realize, isn't about returning to the person you once were. It's about growing into someone new, someone who carries scars as proof of survival and who sees possibility, not in spite of the pain, but because of it. As I look back on everything, the sacrifices, the losses, the difficult boundaries, and the fragile reunions, I see a pattern emerging. Every ending gave rise to a beginning. Every heartbreak held the seeds of something hopeful. After my family and I settled into our new way of relating, I started noticing the ripple effect in other parts of my life. At work, I was more open to collaboration and more willing to admit when I needed help. I listened with more patience and spoke with more conviction. BrightPath Analytics became known not just for its products, but for its culture of support, a place where everyone's voice mattered. Our clients stayed loyal, our team grew, and Mason, who had become like a brother to me, often said, "It feels good here, Lydia. You've built something real." Outside the office, my personal life felt fuller than ever. The friends who'd walked through my darkest days remained by my side. I made space for new connections too, joining a writing group, exploring hiking trails, and even signing up for a cooking class where I laughed at my own clumsy attempts at French pastry. Each new experience was a reminder that joy could be both simple and profound. I learned to trust happiness, to let it linger, instead of worrying that it would be snatched away. One real-life turning point was a letter I received from a former mentee, Jamie, who'd started her own business after hearing me speak at a local workshop. "You taught me that I'm allowed to want more," she wrote, "that I can build my dreams without losing myself." Her words moved me deeply, reminding me that every act of courage, no matter how private, can inspire others to rise as well. As months turned into another year, the meaning of family continued to evolve. My parents and I still had moments of awkwardness, but we also had laughter, quiet talks, and gentle reminders that love is a practice, not a guarantee. When Ben landed a promotion, he called to celebrate, not to ask for anything, but just to share his pride. For my birthday, my mother sent a handmade scarf and a note. "Thank you for teaching us to grow." It was a simple gesture, but it meant the world. With each step forward, I realized that healing forward isn't about forgetting the past or pretending that pain never happened. It's about using those experiences to shape a future that feels honest and whole. I forgave not because the hurt was gone, but because I wanted room for new joys. I set boundaries not out of anger, but out of love for myself and for the people I cared about. One of the most important lessons I learned was the value of self-compassion. There were still days when guilt or old habits tried to creep back in. On those days, I reminded myself that growth is never linear. I allowed myself to rest, to stumble, to start over. I celebrated progress no matter how small and made peace with imperfection. Life, I discovered, is not about getting everything right. It's about getting back up again and again with kindness for yourself and patience for the journey. Another lesson was the power of choosing again and again to show up as my full, authentic self. I no longer measured my worth by how much I gave or how little I needed. Instead, I embraced the simple truth that I am enough just as I am. That realization changed everything: the way I worked, the way I loved, the way I welcomed each new day. I've met so many others along the way: clients, friends, strangers at community events, each on their own path of healing. We share our stories, our fears, and our hard-earned wisdom. I tell them what I've learned. You can honor your past without being chained to it. You can care for others without abandoning yourself. And the greatest act of love is sometimes the courage to rewrite the story. In the end, my life looks nothing like the one I once imagined. It is better, messier, and more real. I still have days of doubt and moments of longing, but I face them with a sense of hope I never had before. I see now that every struggle was not just something to survive, but something that shaped me into a woman who can stand tall, speak honestly, and give generously without losing her own voice. As the sun sets on this chapter, I sit quietly and reflect on the journey. I am grateful for the pain that taught me resilience, for the boundaries that taught me freedom, and for the love, sometimes imperfect, sometimes hard-won, that taught me how to stay. Healing forward means I get to carry it all with me, using every lesson, every scar as a stepping stone toward whatever comes next. If you've seen yourself in my story, if you've ever felt torn between giving and growing, loving and letting go, I want you to know you're not alone. In the final moments of this journey, let's talk about how you too can take the first step toward your own healing forward, and how together we can build lives defined by courage, compassion, and true connection. As we come to the end of this journey together, I want to thank you for walking beside me through every chapter, through the quiet moments of doubt, the courage of setting boundaries, and the steady rediscovery of hope. If there's one thing I hope you carry with you, it's this: you are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to write new rules for love, for family, and for success. Healing doesn't erase the past, but it does open doors to a future that honors every part of who you are. If my story resonated with you, I invite you to take a small, brave step today. Maybe it's reaching out for support, saying no when you need rest, or gently telling your truth to someone you love. Each act of self-respect plants a seed for something better, not just for you, but for everyone whose life you touch. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your own stories of courage, or the lessons you're learning right now. Please share in the comments below. Your voice matters here. And if you know someone who could use this reminder, feel free to share this video with them. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to join me for more honest conversations about life, healing, and the strength it takes to begin again. Thank you for being here. Wherever you are on your journey, I'm rooting for you. Take care, and remember, you are worthy of the life you dream of.